Hello, in the last part of this series, part two, we set up our project in PHP Storm for the first time, and we set up our MySQL or MariaDB database. And finally, we migrated our database for the first time. In part three of this tutorial, we're going to update our user model and our user table migration. We're also going to create a request class to handle the form validation on a new user registration request. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we want to do is modify the create users table. So we want to open up our project in PHP Storm. So I'm going to go ahead and start up PHP Storm. And if you have a previously opened project in PHP Storm, just come up to the file menu up here and hit close project. And that'll bring you back to this screen where you'll be able to select our project, which is the L56 tutorial. And the first thing we want to do is we want to open or expand the database folder and then the migrations folder as well. And you'll see that there is the create users table right here at the top. So we want to double click on that to open it up over here in the editor pane. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to add a new field called username, which is going to be a string. And the maximum length for the username field is going to be 255 characters. And we're making it a unique field, which means the username, once it's taken, cannot be used by any other user. So therefore, each user will have a unique username. And we're also going to add a Boolean field called suspended. So that way, if we need to suspend a user, we will have a way to suspend them. We're going to break the name field into two fields, one for first name and one for last name. And those are both string fields, and they're going to be maximum length of 30 characters, and we're going to default them to an empty string. Then we're going to add all the fields we need for the address 1 line, address 2 line, city, state, postal code, and the phone number. And the address 1 and 2, they're both strings of length 40, maximum length of 40, and there can be null, which means the user, when they sign up, they don't have to put in an address, and we're going to default them to null. Later on, once they register, if they would like to go in and put an address in, they can go back in later and do that. Then the city field is also a string, and that's going to be a maximum length of 30 characters. The state, we're just going to use the 2-letter abbreviation for the state, so that's a maximum length of 2 characters. And we're also setting these all to default values. The postal code is going to be a maximum of 10 characters, and that can be nullable, which means it can be null in the database. And the same thing with the phone number. That's going to be just a set of 14 characters, maximum length. Then the gravatar is basically to bring up a user's gravatar. It's their email address, and then there's some additional things that you need to do to it. So we're just going to make that a string character. We're not going to give it any length, and it can be null. The email is a string column, and it's unique. So the username and the email address are both unique. The password, that's given to us with the Laravel authentication that was already in there. So just leave that one the way it is. And this remember token that was part of the Laravel as well, authentication. And then we're going to add 3 additional fields down here. These are for when a user registers on our site. We want a way to be able to verify their account or their email account. So we're going to use these 3 fields down here to take care of that. So we added a verified field, which is a Boolean, and we default it to false because when a new user signs up, they're not verified, so we set it to false. We have an email token, which we will match, like we will send them the token in an email in the link, they'll click the link, that'll come back to our site and check this email token and make sure it matches. And then this is the timestamp for when the email token was created. And we're just going to make that a timestamp, and we're going to make it nullable, and we're going to default it to null. So my point here is everything has a default value. That way, when we create a new instance of our model, the only thing that doesn't have a default value, if you notice, is the password. But when we create a new instance of this model, we won't get any MySQL or MariaDB warnings because we're setting them to a default value. And you'll notice then our down function is just dropping the table if it exists. So go ahead and make those changes to this. And then close that file out. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to and you can follow along in my article here. I go step by step how to go through each process that I'm showing you here in this video. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to modify the model, because if you open up or expand the app folder and you see that the user.php file here is the model for that table. So if we double click on that and we open it, you'll notice there is an array basically up here. It's a protected field and it's called fillable. And that means when someone goes onto one of your pages on your site and they fill out a form for this model, the form fields, will be named username, first name, last name, etc. These are the fields that are accepted from the form submission. If they're not in here, then they cannot be changed. Like if you look down here, these protected fields, password or remember token, there's no way that those could be set or changed from a form submission. And then we're just going to add one extra function down here, and this is called get name attribute. And what that means is it's going to, when we say in our, say, Blade template, for example, we say user, and then we say name, like that. That's going to return what we have here. So it's going to return the first name with a space in the middle, and then the last name. So when we say username, that's going to return the full name to us. And so whenever you want to return attributes like that, you just create a getter method and you just give it the name of the attribute, which is name, which is what we want, and then attribute after that. So if we were going to say get the phone number, we would say get phone number attribute. And you'll notice we have an underscore under here. We would just replace that with nothing. We would remove that, and then we would use the camel case syntax. So every word except for the first word would be capitalized. So we would make this an uppercase N. So it would be like this. Phone, or we'll do the whole thing. Get phone number attribute. And that's how you would do that. And so you would just create a function with that name, that signature, and then that would get you the phone number. Now, we don't need to do it for the phone number because it's already an attribute or a field in our database table. The only reason we need to do it for this get name attribute, because you'll see we don't have the full name up here. We just have the first name and last name. So we want to concatenate them together and then return the full name. So you could, I guess you could make this get full name, and then it would be user full name, not just name then. So once you make those changes, go ahead and close that out, and then we are going to migrate our database. So if you look at my article here, actually we're going to make the user request for the validation. So if you follow in my article, you would, from the root directory of your application, you would put in PHP artisan make request and call it user request. And then Once you execute that command, you'll notice under app HTTP, you have a request folder. And right there is our user request that we made. So if you just double click on that and you open that, you're going to have two functions in here. You're going to have one that says authorize, and you're going to have one that says roles. Now, this authorize method is used in conjunction with like your policies and everything, which we're going to get into further in the project. But for now, just make that return true for right now. And then your roles are, what are you requiring to make it a valid field? So, for example, the first name field it's a required field, which means they must fill that field in the form on our website. It needs to be a string, so any character that would make up a valid string is acceptable, and the maximum is 30 characters long. And so if you want to take a quick look at the Laravel documentation on that, I believe I do have the link to it in here in my article, but if you just do a search in Google on Laravel validation, that'll bring you up right to the page on it on the Laravel site. It'll bring you directly to the validation. And then if you come down a little ways and you click on this available validation rules, you'll see all the validation rules that are acceptable. Like it must be a date, must be an email field, etc. So you can just click on these, and if you want to find out more information, just click on them and you'll see what they are. Like the string field under validation must be a string. If you would like to allow the field to also be null, you should assign the nullable role to the field. So if you go back here, you'll notice that there is one called nullable. So I would suggest just doing the search, Google search on that, bringing this up and coming down to this section, available validation rules, and just taking a few minutes and looking over some of these. The Laravel validation is very good. Now, it doesn't cover exactly everything. In some situations, you may need to use a regular expression, which we'll get into later on. But just very quickly on it, you'll notice I did create a regular expression for the username. So if you want to just copy this, what I have here, what that's doing is it's just validating and making sure that it meets the requirements I'm setting up for a valid username. And I'm basically saying here that it needs to start with a letter or a number. So it has to be at least a letter or a number for the first character. Then after the first character, it can be a letter, a number, or the underscore character. And it must be a total length of 8 to 24 characters. And the reason this says 7 to 23 is because this first character right here must be there, and it must be a letter or a number. So we have to add that one to these totals over here. So it can be a maximum of between 8 to 24 characters. But it must be at least 8 characters long. And it must be unique in the users table. So if we look at the users table again, go back to my database folder here. And if we look at our users migration, we did say here that it must be unique. So we can use that as a validation rule. We can say the username field must be unique in the users table. And same thing with the email one here. It has to be a string that's required. It must be a valid email address. It can be a maximum length of 255 characters, and it must be unique in the users table. So that's how the Laravel validation works. Now, there is another method that we could put in here. There's one called messages, and so we could create custom messages when one of these fails validation. So for example, we could say first name when it's must be a string. We could, and it fails that validation rule, we could return a custom message. And we will get into that a little bit later on in the tutorial. It's a nice handy feature, and sometimes you may want to use it. So you would just create another method here called public function messages, And then you would also return an array, like this is returning an array here. You would return an array with messages for each one of these validation rules. So once you go ahead and make those changes, we are ready to migrate the database, do a fresh migration on the database so that we can make our changes. Because when we migrated it the first time, we only had the name, the email, and the password field. And since we added all those additional fields, we need to remigrate the database again. So now there is a couple other changes in here that we need to make. If you look at the login controller, so basically after creating our request object, we basically need to designate a way for the login controller to use our request object. So what we want to do is, under this app folder, the HTTP folder, and then under controllers, and then auth, you'll see that we have a login controller and a register controller. So we need to make a change to this login controller. These are the changes we need to make because we're no longer going to be using the email address as the field to log in. We are going to use the username field. So we're going to override a method in the authenticates users trait. So you'll see here we're using the authenticates users. That's in that parent class. So we're going to override that method. The username is the name of the method. So we're just going to create a method in this controller, and then we're going to return the username field instead of returning the email address field. So that's very important. Make sure you make that change as well. And then we're going to also need to change the register controller. So the last thing we're going to do is we need to make some changes in the register controller so that we use this user request object that we created. So our user request object that we just created, we need to designate in here that we want to use that. So in this register method, we need to put the user request object in here. So we want to say user request, and then we will have access to that user request, that object that we created. And don't forget to put the use statement up here as well. So we need to tell it that we want to use our user request object that we created. And then down here in the function signature, the parameter is going to be our user request object. So make sure you make that change as well. And then at that point, everything else should fairly be the same. So this method, I believe, is not already in there, or you just need to make those changes of that I have up here on the article. So and we also did remove the validation function that was in there too. So there's a function in there called validator. We're going to remove that because one of the nice things about creating the request object, since it's already in here in our function signature, Laravel already knows to check those validation rules first before doing anything else. And if it fails, then it automatically redirects the user back to that form to correct those errors. So we want to remove that validator method in there and override that register method. So this method is not going to be in there. It's a method that needs to be overridden in the register users trait. So you'll see we're using that, and this method is in that parent class, and we're going to override that method. So this method right here, you want to add that in there after you remove the validator method. So remove this validator method and put this method in there in its place. So you can come right here to my blog article and you can just highlight everything and right click on it and say copy and paste it in there if you would like. But the important things I'd like to point out is just that you designated right here that you wanted to use the user request object, and you removed this validator method because we're no longer using it. We're now using the one that's in the user request class that we created. And then we want to remove that create function that's in here. So if you'll notice down below here, we want to remove this and then replace it. You want to replace it so that it has our additional fields. We, remember, changed the name field to 2 fields, and we also added the username field. So we need to update the create method. So when someone registers, after the validation is passed and everything else, this method right here creates the user for us. And then we, also save it into the database. So make sure you go ahead and make those changes as well. And then if you look here, I have the whole entire class, what it should look like when it's finished making the changes. So if you want to copy and paste, that's fine. Just take note of what we did and the important things that we changed so you have an understanding of what we're actually doing. And then once you make all those changes, we're going to migrate the database fresh. So if you look at my database, I'll bring it up here real quick. And right here's the database for there. You'll notice that under users, and you look at the structure, I had already done my fresh migration and I have all the additional fields that we created in here. If you look at yours, you're just going to have the ID field, the name, the email, password, the remember token, and the created at and updated timestamps. So to do a fresh migration, just change to the root folder for your application, which mine is in tutorials L56 tutorial. And so if I do PHP artisan, migrate, and then fresh, that will drop all the tables. See, it dropped all the tables, and then it recreated them. So if we had data stored in here, all the data would be lost. But if you notice, we now have the fresh database table with all of our additional fields in there. And just one last point I would like to make out is down here, if you look at the end of my article, sometimes when you come in here to do your, say, migration or something like that, you'll get a warning saying that it can't write to the Laravel.log file. So if you will just close this all up and re-expand the storage folder here so it's a little bit easier to follow. Open up the storage folder and then you go into the expand the logs folder. There's a Laravel.log file in here normally when it needs to write to it. So sometimes you'll be in your application doing something and Apache created the log file because right now it doesn't exist in here. You'll notice I have no Laravel.log file. So you'll be in here doing something and there'll be an error in your program or something like that and it needs to write to the log file, so that Apache creates the log file. And then later on, you'll come back here in the terminal and you need to do something where it needs to access the log file. So it can't access it or write to it because Apache is the owner of the log file. So what you can do in that case is you can remove it and then come back to your terminal window, rerun your command that you needed to do. It creates the log file and we'll give it owner's permissions for your user currently in Linux. So then sometimes you'll come back and that log file was created in that scenario, and you'll be in your application and you'll get the same error. You'll get an error message up here saying it can't write to the log file because Apache needs to write to it, doesn't have ownership. So same thing, you can then just come back and remove it again using this right here. You can remove it and then come back and refresh your page in your browser, and everything should be fine at that point. So I just wanted to point that out because that's a kind of an easy fix to take care of that issue. So that pretty much concludes this tutorial, the part 3. In part 4, we'll see you there.